Welcome to Caserta's Data Intelligence web series. In this series, we talk about what it takes to go from a good data and analytics leader to a great one. We'll share with you the tools and methodologies you need to build better, faster, and more robust, as well as strategies and frameworks to generate more revenue and grow your business. Featuring some very special guests and experts to inspire you and give you advice and direction on your data journey. And now, introducing your host, Caserta Data and Analytics Evangelist and VP Marketing, Remy Rosenbaum.
Everybody, and welcome to the next episode in Caserta's Data Intelligence webinar series. I'm your host, Remy Rosenbaum, and today we're going to be talking about generating, harnessing, and sharing metadata. This is the theme of the second episode in the special six-part series on how to operationalize data governance. And today, to talk about this very pressing topic, we have Brent Walter, who is Caserta's data architect and sales engineer, who works with our clients across a broad range of regulated industries, from financial services to healthcare and research. He has a particular interest and expertise in leveraging data and technology to address compliance and risk management challenges. And take it away, Brent.
Great, thanks for that, Remy. Well, hi everyone, as Remy's mentioned, I'm Brent Walter and I'm with Caserta. So what I want to do in this presentation is talk about metadata, and specifically I want to talk about some of the challenges that people often face when trying to implement a metadata management program, and really to impart on you 4 lessons that we've learned in building metadata management programs for our clients. But to sort of frame things, the first thing I want to do is sort of talk about the challenge around metadata really briefly. So before I kick off, let's just sort of recap on a definition of metadata. So metadata, usually we're talking about 3 different kinds of metadata. We've got our technical metadata, which is the one that most IT people are familiar with. And the technical metadata are things like the schema, the description of a field, the data type of the field, all of that kind of good stuff. The second type of metadata is operational metadata, and that operational or process metadata has a lot to do with how the data is getting generated, right? So when the last run was, or what the lineage of the metadata might be. And the operational metadata can be pretty tricky to deal with and pretty tricky to gather. And then the third kind of metadata, which is actually in our view probably the most important of the kinds of metadata, is business metadata. And that business metadata is where we capture our business definitions. Now, if you like, our business know-how about our data. So that might be things like usage notes. It might be things about the periods over which data was captured. It might be notes on specific business definitions of terms that are missing from our technical metadata. Now, data governance practice tells us that metadata is super important. The problem is that most of us don't do a super good job of getting metadata right. Usually we find that our clients get caught up on one or two specific types of metadata, and then a third kind of metadata will get overlooked or not treated as well. And typically, if a program's being run by IT, we're going to get a heavy focus on that technical and on the process metadata, and we're really going to leave things like business metadata on the wayside, or at least leave it to the business to sort that out later. And we're not a big fan of that particular kind of approach. So anyway, in our experience of developing programs around metadata as part of data governance initiatives, or just part of standard data cleanliness initiatives, we really have 4 lessons that we want to impart to you. The first is to understand the end user. And what we mean by this is to understand how the metadata is being used, who's using the metadata, and sort of how frequently the metadata is being used. The second lesson is to always start with that business metadata. It's the hardest to capture, and it's the hardest to maintain. And so if you solve for the business metadata, you often solve for most of the other problems around metadata management. I've got an asterisk next to that, which we'll talk about a little bit later. The next is, like any program, particularly if you're a smaller or medium-sized enterprise, start small, be deliberate, and set goals around what you want to get out of your metadata program, and then measure against those. And then the fourth lesson is not to overcomplicate. It can be really, really easy to go out and buy a vendor solution and think that you've solved the problem, or to go out and buy a vendor solution and spend 6 or 12 or 18 months trying to integrate that solution into every tool that you've got in your environment. If you're a large enterprise, that might be the way that you have to do it. But if you're a smaller, more nimble enterprise, we'd really encourage you not to overcomplicate. So I'm going to move through each of these. But firstly, let's talk about how we start a metadata program. And we really think that there are 4 questions, another 4, that you really want to sort of ask yourself. So the first is, what are your drivers? Are your drivers regulatory? Are they commercial? Are they IT transformation? This is really going to flavor what you prioritize or what you deprioritize, what you do first, what you do last. If you're dealing with regulatory issues, you're going to have to get to lineage a lot quicker. If you're dealing simply for commercial issues, then your business definitions are going to be the first. Business definitions and user search are going to be the first things that you really want to address. The next thing that you want to ask yourself is where you are now. And here we mean, what's your technology posture, and what is your overall data maturity? If you were to go out into your community and ask to start collecting business metadata, are people going to understand that? And so you're going to need to do some planning around that to figure out how you're going to interact both with users and your broader data community of producers and suppliers more broadly. The next question that you really want to ask is, what are your constraints? What are the resources available to you? Do you have a budget? Do you have skills? Do you have sponsors? Do you have structures, right? If you are a data engineer and you're going to try and do this all on your own, you're probably not going to succeed. You really need to ask and be really ruthlessly honest about what your resources are, and also who you are in the organization and what your ability to be able to sponsor a metadata program is. So moving on to our first lesson, which is to understand the end user. So the first thing that we really want to do is try to get a sense of what the hierarchy of our user needs are. And so I've got an example here on the screen. This doesn't apply to every enterprise by any means. It's not a one size fits all, but typically this is an ordering that we'd see. So users are really interested in search. They're really interested in what they need to do to access the data, definitions, all of that kind of good stuff. And it's really important to kind of get those into a forced ranked or forced ordered list, so that you've got some definite, a definite sense of what users think is important. But that's not the whole story. What you want to do is also look at how frequently users are going to use particular aspects of metadata or particular features of the metadata management system that you're going to put in place, or facility that you want to put in place. And so here, what you'll see is something that might be a little bit counterintuitive. For example, search is maybe very important to users, but it's not actually used that often. And the reason for that is pretty simple. Most businesses or most users in most organizations are focused on one or two fairly small concerns that might use 3 or 4 data sets in total, and that's their entire universe. They're never going to search for anything else again. That doesn't apply to all users, but we need to sort of think about what the general case of user is. Whereas those same users, and in fact all users, are going to constantly rely on our business definitions and our usage notes, and then information about our spatial and temporal dimensions, as well as schema details. These are things that users will come back to again and again and again, because they'll be asking different kinds of business questions and they'll need clarification constantly. So it's really important to sort of understand both what users think is important and how that importance sort of spreads in terms of frequency of use. But once we've done that, we're able to plot a path to success. So here, what I've done is I've just clustered our activities, and I've kind of been able to form some initiatives around it. So I've just called these gather, instrument, and enhance. And in gather, I'm really going to focus on getting my data. In instrument, I'm going to focus on making my data available and making it useful and enhance. And then in the enhance, I'm going to deal with more complicated issues. So once you've got sort of a sense of the directions that you want to go, our next lesson is to really focus on business metadata first, again, because it's the most difficult. So as I mentioned earlier, if we solve for business metadata, just about everything else falls in place. And the reason for that is that, one, it's really high value data. So you have to understand the problems around protection, versioning, and all of that good stuff really early on in the piece. Also, because it's high value, it's going to attract users to it. Users are going to want to interact with your metadata facility more if the data that they're accessing is highly valuable. And that's going to drive further investment in your platform over time. The second is, it has a diverse range of use cases that are associated with the business metadata. The third is that it needs a village, right? So it's going to encourage you to get out and interact with business users and to form communities of practice around metadata. And that's critical to making any metadata program work. It's also really challenging to maintain, right? So you're going to have to introduce some process, or maybe you don't want to introduce process immediately. Maybe you want to let it grow organically. But nevertheless, keeping it up to date, keeping it refreshed, finding owners, putting governance over the top of that is going to be challenging. And it's important. It's really good to put that on your radar early so that you can start addressing those problems as your program grows and becomes more important. But the other thing that business metadata is really important for is governance itself, because it is the authoritative record of what the data is, where it's used in the business, and who owns it. So just really briefly, some alternatives to looking at business metadata first, and why you may not want to do that. If you start with something like technical metadata, it's relatively easy to do, but what you end up with is a very IT-centric project. You'll get a database and you'll get it integrated into to every ETL tool under the sun, but it's not going to be of much use to end users, because what end users are interested in is, in the context of what I do day to day, what is this data for? The second is, the second option would be to start with operational metadata. And that's going to be really hard unless you've got a pre-existing documentation culture, because operational metadata gets into issues like lineage, and lineage can be pretty thorny to sort of sort out, particularly if you're doing it retroactively. And this can become a real sort of sticking point. You can get stuck in these issues for months and months and months, and users won't see any value at the end of your program, and ultimately your management won't see any value for the investment that they've put into the program so far. So on to our third lesson: be small, be deliberate, and set goals. So this is hugely important. Like any program of governance, like any program of control, you want to identify a couple of small areas and say, that's where we're going to focus, that's what we're going to manage first of all. And the reason that we want to do that is that we want to try and maximize the chances for success. We also want to really sort of feel out what the problems in our approach and our programs are. And that's much easier to do and correct on a small scale than it is on a large scale. But we also want to be ambitious in terms of setting goals. If we set goals and we achieve our goals, then we're going to attract more management attention, more dollars to invest in our programs. So as I talked about, this is just a repeat of the slide from earlier, but we really want to talk about bite-sized initiatives. So rather than trying to do your entire gather phase for the whole organization all at once, you might want to pick one or two subject areas and refine the approach to how you engage with the business, how you capture that information, how you codify that information, and indeed other problems like where you store it and how you update it. It's also really important to remember that we're really just dealing with data. Metadata is not special when it comes to data. It's got some special characteristics, but managing it isn't. Because it's just data, you can collect it any old way that you want to start with, and we can always pick it up and transform it later if we really need to. So our advice here is to start really, really simple. Create a basic schema, pick a file format or pick a basic repository, start collecting your metadata, and take a bet that technology is going to be able to help you out later. And I've got an example of that coming up. More importantly, or at least in this is probably the most important part, you always want to measure, evaluate your progress, and repeat that continuously. Be really ruthless about measuring the usage of the metadata, but also your success in gathering and managing that metadata. So come up with some measures early, even if they're basic, and ruthlessly measure against those so that you've got something to report. Lesson 4, don't overcomplicate. This is where we find a lot of programs around metadata get into a lot of problem. Some red flags that you might be starting to overcomplicate things are if you find yourself evaluating products rather than gathering data. At the end of the day, metadata is a data gathering exercise. It's not a product selection exercise. It's not really even a management exercise. It's a gathering and maintaining kind of exercise. Yes, you need tools to help you do that, but should the tools be first and foremost in your mind? No, it's the process that should be first and foremost in your mind. Not engaging owners and users is another red flag. If you haven't been out and you're not talking to communities, communities of users, communities of data owners, there's probably something going on in the way that your program's operating that suggests that it's a little bit too complicated. Also, doing things like developing overly complicated schemas. Okay, let's remember that we're dealing with people that have other jobs. They're not going to be happy to fill out 20 fields on each particular data set that they're responsible and managing for. 5 is probably a much better thing. Focusing on the richness of the data that you gather from the user rather than how it's specifically organized is probably more important than anything else. If you're spending months debating schemas, you also know that you're in trouble. I won't bother going through the rest of this list, but these are some typical red flags that we would see. In terms of not overcomplicating things, what you want to do is focus on the basics and then just add useful features, right? So back a couple of slides ago, we talked about the first sort of innovation that we'd add to our metadata repository would be a search interface, because that's how users are going to get in and sort of discover what metadata is there, and then be able to interact with that metadata. So here we've got a very minimalist approach that sort of any business could put in place tomorrow, and it's not going to give you a perfectly managed metadata system. It requires a fair bit of user interaction, particularly on the management of things. It can be refined over time, but the point is that this is all focused on gathering as much data as you can as quickly as possible and getting that into the hands of users where it's going to be most useful, because that's really what's going to drive value from the program. And then after you've got the data in front of the user or made the data available to users to use, then we're able to add additional technology or additional tools to enrich that data. And an example of this might be that we might install a natural language processing module that adds some enrichment, that starts breaking apart the natural language that we have. So here the descriptions of what the data is, and then making observations on that data. So here where we see that there's some language that suggests that there's a restriction on the data, so we're going to have a flag that we generate, which is called, it's restricted. We've got a location, so we can generate a geo flag by bringing in some other reference data. And we can take from the sentiment of even just these short text paragraphs that the data or that the reliability of the underlying data may not be great, and that's the kind of information that you really want your users to be aware of. But the point is to be really incremental with this. And yes, don't get me wrong, there are some great products on the market that you can go and plug in that will do a lot of this for you. But if you are budget constrained, and if you are putting your resources in gathering the data, this can be a way to generate some value quickly. And then you can integrate into other tools later on because you've got all of the data ready to go and you can pull it out of open systems. And then the last part of keeping things simple is to introduce control gradually. It's often tempting to want to put permissions over the top of everything and put sort of heavy control in, users may not change this. Early on, we'd encourage people to rely on passive control mechanisms. And what I mean by that is you take advantage of things like object versioning inside of object stores. So this is where we can take snapshots of what the data look like. The user doesn't need to be aware of it. And then we can layer in our control once we get to some predefined critical mass of data when we decide that we actually have a management problem, by which time we will have figured out what data really needs to be protected and what data really needs, and what elements of our metadata really need to be governed. And then we can design a program and apply that program appropriately and justify ourselves to the users as part of a journey, rather than delivering a whole bunch of rules to users up front and saying, thou shalt do. So I'm at the end of the deck, and just to recap, these are our 4 key lessons, which is to understand the end user, to always start with the metadata, to always start with business metadata, to start small, be deliberate, and set goals, and not to overcomplicate. And we think that if particularly in the cases that we've talked about, small and medium enterprises, as well as if you are in a large enterprise, but you only have a very small remit to get a metadata program in place, if you can do these 4 steps or apply these 4 lessons, we're pretty sure that you're going to get a much bigger initiative approved. And that's when you'll get the keys to the castle and be able to look at the really exciting technologies that exist around metadata and metadata management. And Remy, back to you.
Brent, that was an amazing presentation. Thank you for all the insight on business metadata and operational metadata and talking about governance with us. So we have a few questions that we already have. And if anyone would like to ask any more questions for Brent, you can please do so in the questions panel on the right. So the first question is, with the advent of privacy legislation like GDPR and CCPA, are there any legal ramifications around metadata? And how does your solution address these novel regulatory needs?
So thanks for that, Remy. It's a really good question. And I'll start out by answering the second part of the question first, which is that architecture isn't going to solve your GDPR or your CCPA problems. It's just not. It would be dishonest to suggest so. When it comes to GDPR and CCPA, the metadata plays two roles, and it's actually a really critical component of the compliance program that you'll put in place around both those subjects. So the first is it's really important to recognize which parts of your metadata might be capturing sort of user activities and whatnot that would be captured under the ambit of those regulations. That data has to be protected. It also has to be tagged and discoverable so that you're able to respond to information requests from your end users and your customers, but also respond to requests to delete and enforce the right to be forgotten and those kind of things. The other place that the metadata is really important is in sort of the tagging of what's private metadata, sorry, what's private data in the actual data sets that you've got. So metadata really, in the context of GDPR and CCPA, has 2 roles. The first is to identify what is protected, and then secondly, it may be the subject of GDPR itself. Now, one really important thing I want to point out is that your metadata solution isn't going to solve your compliance problems. Your compliance problems are going to be solved through a combination of bespoke technologies as well as off-the-shelf technologies that are focused on data governance issues. It's one of the key parts of GDPR and CCPA is the audit trail that you need to be able to produce to demonstrate that you've satisfied a user's request to identify all of the data that you hold on them and delete it. That is a non-trivial task to do in large organizations, and it's a whole subject of its own that's well outside of the domain of metadata proper.
we could do a whole separate presentation just on the legal ramifications of it.
Absolutely.
But today we will just talk about the tech. This is a good question. The next one is about tech stack. For an organization that's just in the early stages of its strategy around, metadata strategy and data governance in general, what tech would you recommend? What are the first bits of tech you would recommend for an organization?
Yeah.
Which vendors pop
So,
out?
yeah, so that's a really good question as well. And it's going to depend on what your drivers are. So back to, I think it's the second slide that I showed. So if your drivers are really around facilitating the gathering of metadata, of business metadata, and making that available so that data scientists from across the organization are able to and just general business users are able to locate data that they may not have been able to locate before, and access the information about how to, how to gain access to that data, then you might want to you might want to look at some platforms that incorporate a lot of social and crowdsourcing components to them, and there are a couple of those on the market. Elation being a really good example of that. Those tools are going to help you in essentially your survey effort as you go out to the business and ask them to contribute metadata. Contribute business metadata, but also to sort of start gathering information on the potential quality of some of the data sets from a purely business standpoint. If your drivers, on the other hand, are more technical, right? So if they're more centered on IT transformation or on regulatory issues, then you're probably going to want to start with a governance program, and then bolt your metadata platform onto that. The other thing that you'll want to take into consideration is whether or not you're on the cloud. So for example, if you're heavily into GCP has a data catalog. That data catalog is probably not the most user-friendly data catalog, but it is a core component of some of the newer security features that are being made available in BigQuery. And so you'll need to incorporate the platform the platform data catalog into your overall strategy. That means that you've got another integration point to deal with. Now, the nice thing about that particular solution is that it'll go away, and I think this is the rule on AWS as well. Those solutions will go away and do a lot of the gathering of the technical metadata for you, and make that available through APIs that you can ingest into other tools. So it's not as big and as scary as it probably sounds to have, potentially two data catalogs running at once.
Okay, that's excellent. And final question, which program would you recommend first, your governance or your metadata program?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question, and it's one that I got asked a couple of days ago, actually, on a call with a client. The answer is that the two really need to evolve side by side, right? It's not one or the other. Your governance program is going to be heavily reliant on metadata, and so you're going to need to put measures in place to start generating it, particularly that business metadata again. And then your metadata program more broadly is going to rely on components of your governance program, particularly when you start wanting to update the business definitions and standardize business definitions and metrics and things like that across the organization. That's all going to be driven through your data governance program. Precisely where you start, though, and what drives what is going to depend on where you are in the organization and what your drivers are. If you are the data governance person, the expectation is that you're going to be putting a data governance program in place first and really focusing on that, and then sort of doing the business metadata gathering and grooming in the background. If, on the other hand, you're a chief analytics officer and you're trying to make data available more generally in the organization, then the business metadata is probably where you're going to start, with the governance being a secondary but still really, really important concern.
Got it. All right, Brent, thank you so much for today. That's all the time we have for questions. And if you have any further questions, please email me to remy@caserta.com. Thank you, and I'll see you at the next webinar.